using rubber stamps with metal clays. When I used to teach classes in person, many times enrollees would bring rubber stamps to the class to use with metal clay, and I would say, sure, go ahead, use your stamp. And they would try, and more often than not get a little frustrated with their imprints that were uneven, too deep here and too shallow there. I too used to think, easy peasy, I'll just press the stamp into the clay. And even when I thought I had a good stamp and went on with the piece, well, the patina never lied. So here is how to use rubber stamps and get good results, which they're kind of like using a texture mat when you think of it, sort of. If this is hard for your brain to understand what I'm showing you and you find the technique hard to reproduce, don't worry. My brain does not work the way it needs to figure this out. So most of the time, I use the similar technique, this technique, without actually measuring the thickness of my stamp or counting thickness slats. So once I understood why I would want to use a rubber stamp in this fashion, I just began guesstimating the thickness and then adjusting it with the, taking or adding thickness slats. Basically the old trial and error method, which one can do with metal clay, and yet another reason why I love working with it. So let's get started. I have chosen these rubber stamps. They are kind of big for demonstration purposes. The first thing I do is separate the textured stamp from the sponge and wood block. I also peel off the sponge and throw it away. The glue is atrocious. I keep working it to one end of the rubber stamp or one side of the stamp to remove it. You could use Goo Be Gone or some other chemical. It is important to get all the glue off, the goal being to get a flat rubber stamp. So once I've done that, I oiled the stamp, and here begins the trick of the calculations, calculating the depths, at which I am lousy, like I said, and it is almost guaranteed that I will have to roll more than once to get the depth of the imprint that I want. So I determine the depth of the stamp by setting it alongside my thickness slats or cards and building up the slats until the tops are even, and then I count the cards. Then I examine the stamp and its swirls and dots. Do I want the texture 1 card into the clay, 2 cards deep, 3 cards? I decide I want this stamp to go into my clay only 1 card deep. Say my stamp is 4 cards thick. Here is a side view of my rubber stamp. The 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the left are thickness slats, typically plain cards. That's kind of the standard. Say I am making a pendant out of this and I want the clay on my final piece, or I want to make this pendant 3 cards thick. The top plain portion on this slide with the 1, 2, 3 is a side view of my pendant, 3 cards thick. Again, I want the stamp texture to be imprinted 1 card deep into the clay. The bottom portion on this slide then is a side view of my 3 card thick pendant, wet clay of course on the bottom, the rubber stamp on top of that, and I added 3 cards because I wanted my rubber stamp 1 card thick into the clay. So using this technique I'm about to show you, I would use 6 cards, which is 3 plus 3. And you can see that the stamp would be 1 card into the clay. Because I made up these numbers, you can disregard the colors of the slats in these photographs as we continue here, because in this demo I used blue and red slats. Blue is 4 cards thick and red is 6 cards thick, which means I used actually 10 cards on this example. In truth, my stamp was way thicker than 4 cards. But use the numbers I've given here in the previous drawings so it makes sense. So I rolled the clay 3 cards thick, the thickness I want my pendant, at least the wet clay part. I placed the oiled stamp on top, texture toward the clay, and I add 3 cards as the math above determined. Or for me, trial and error, remember? Now, I don't roll this. If I rolled, I would get shadows or ghosts of the stamp in my clay. You can use any flat tool that you have on hand. I'm going to use a tool that I made. It's a snake roller. I just took a piece of glass and super glued a handle to it. You can use anything that's flat, and it does not need to be transparent like glass. So I press down firmly and evenly with a piece of glass. And here is my impression. Time to carry on with my design and creation to completion. Remember, my thicknesses were different than the demo calculation if you notice that this imprint is deeper than 1 card thick. Stamps vary quite a bit. The commercial rubber stamp for my paper is in my hand, tucked away, and a Teresa Collins stamp maker stamp is in my fingers. The Teresa Collins stamp is very thin. It is my maker's mark. Like, couldn't even do this 1 card thick. I would have to scale everything down quite a bit to get good results with this one. And I have been known to use like a piece of cardstock as a 1/2 card thickness slat. You may need to get just a little creative with your tools as well as your design. And for this, you might want to check out an I Love Silver course. It's a basics course called Tools and Shapers and Holders. So when you're finished with your clay creation, be sure to clean your stamp. Where can you store your stamp? There usually is enough adhesive left over on the wood block to stick it back on there for storing it well, storing it flat. You can cut rubber stamps too. For example, you could make individual letter stamps from this larger one. Do you have any rubber stamps around? New ones or old ones? Thick or thin? So once you realize you can use rubber stamps easily with clay, it opens up a lot of possibilities. Hope you enjoyed this course.